This time it's 5 classic British 350s from the 1950s. In the early years of motorcycling, the 350 class was extremely important. These are the most common machines on the road for many years. They were the bikes that people rode to work on, the bikes that people went out for weekend rides on, and sometimes the machines that people raced on too. It's the 350 was seen as a good, sturdy, dependable bike with just the right amount of power given the roads of the time. And so here are 5 classic British 350cc motorcycles from the 1950s. The Aerial KH350 Red Hunter. The Red Hunter series was Aerial's sporting machines, and the singles dated all the way back to 1932 and are the work of one Valentine Page, Aerial's chief designer at that time. But it was one Edward Turner who gave the machines their tagline, the Red Hunter series. He also came up with a chrome and red finish for the more sporting models in the range. Originally these were 250, 350 and 500cc singles. The first post-war designs of course bore a striking resemblance to their pre-war counterparts, although of course they now had telescopic forks replacing those pre-war girders. The engine however was essentially the same, a 346cc 4-stroke overhead valve engine with a 72 by 85 bore and stroke and a lowly 6.2 to 1 compression ratio. Aerial claimed peak power at around 19 horsepower. This was fed through a 4-speed gearbox to give a top speed of just over 70 miles an hour. The bike weighed in at 159 kilos or 350 pounds. Although as Trials 8 Sammy Miller would prove, these machines could be greatly lightened to make a hell of a good trials machine. Of course, he used the 500 version. Very early post-war models of course had rigid rear ends, although plunger suspension was later adapted, and on very late models a swinging arm was used too. The machine would remain in production until the end of the 50s, when Aerial would sweep their entire 4-stroke range aside for the new Aerial Leader and Aerial Arrow 2-strokes. A move sadly lamented by many fans of big aerials. The Triumph 3TA. The Triumph 3TA was introduced in 1957 and replaced the earlier 3T pre-unit model. It ushered in a range of bold new ideas. It was unit construction and of course had the all-enclosed bodywork. Now of course all enclosures were nothing new, they'd been trialled out and been popular for time at least in the 1930s, although they of course had died out, it being a fairly brief fad. And this was the same really in the 1950s and into the early 60s, and by the turn of the decade the enclosures were becoming gradually less excessive, eventually disappearing completely by the mid-60s. The bike is sometimes called the 21. This is because it's 21 cubic inches, but also because it celebrated the 21st anniversary of the Triumph Engineering Company that had been set up by Jack Sangster on his takeover of the company in the 1930s. The 3TA was the first unit construction Triumph, and was joined very quickly by a unit construction version of the Speed 22, not surprisingly known as the 5TA. Unusually for the class, the 3TA ran a twin-cylinder engine of 348 cc's with a bore and stroke of 58.3 by 65.5. The compression ratio was 7.5 to 1, and with this the machine produced around 18.5 horsepower, which is put out for a 4-speed gearbox. Surprisingly for a twin, the machine weighed in at just 154 kilos or 340 pounds. The downside of this is it was achieved by really having a fairly skimpy frame. In fact, for the top down tube, the gas tank was used as a stressed member, something that would continue to be a feature of the design for a number of years, and would really give rise to those flexi-flame Triumph jibes. But for all that, by the standards of the time, the machine was smooth, refined and very practical, so it was a very popular choice. In the 60s it was joined by a rather more sporty Tiger 90 version, and that bulky bodywork was reduced in size in 1964 before being deleted completely in 66. That being the final year of production, for the base model 3TA. The Tiger 90 would continue on into the late 60s, however. The Royal Enfield Bullet 350. Famed for its off-road prowess, the Bullet being the most successful heavyweight trials bike of all time, the Royal Enfield Bullet was introduced in 1948 and is credited with the longest unchanged production run over any motorcycle in history. The Bullet had been introduced in 1931 as the sporting model of Royal Enfield's single-cylinder range. But it's the post-war bikes introduced in 1949 which of course are best known. The machine ran an overhead valve head which was aluminium, iron still being a popular material for cylinder heads at that time. But the most notable feature of course was their pioneering use of a swinging arm rear suspension system, because at the time many riders believed that rigid rear ends were the way to go for trials riding. But the works rider Johnny Britton proved time and again the Royal Enfield's frame had rendered most of the opposition completely obsolete overnight. The bike made around 18 horsepower, and this was put out for a 4-speed Albion gearbox, which featured a neutral finder, a very handy feature I must say when you're stuck in traffic. After earlier assembling bikes in kit form, in 1955 full production of the machine was set up at a factory in Madras, now of course modern Chennai. And production of these machines would be ramped up to around 20,000 units annually until the end of the production of the original Bullet, right up until 2007. This is the great advantage of meaning that Bullet parts are very plentiful and very cheap, with pattern parts being made in India in great numbers. This can make the Bullet an ideal first classic. Parts are plentiful and the bike is simple and easy to live with. I would own one of these bikes and even put a sidecar on the poor thing, a job which it did surprisingly well. The BSA B31. The BSA B31 was introduced in 1945 and was the first all-new model introduced by BSA after the end of World War II. Although of course a number of its features were shared with earlier machines from the pre-war era. The engine was a 348cc overhead valve single-cylinder unit. This produced around 17 horsepower and was enough to see the machine at just over 70 miles an hour. Initial post-war machines of course were rigid rear end, although it would later use plungers but with proper swinging arm suspension arriving in 1954. The B31 was one of the last of the line of BSA's traditional big singles, of course being pre-unit and running a long stroke of 71 by 88mm. Compression was fairly low at 6.5 to 1 and there was, as you might expect, dry sump lubrication and a 4-speed gearbox. The bike did share a lot of its chassis components with the bigger twins, so unfortunately all-out weight was fairly heavy at around 385 pounds, or 175 kilos, making it quite a bit heavier than Triumph 3TAs for example. However, much of this weight came from the excellent chassis, so it might have been heavier, but that rigid chassis really helped handling, and absorbed some of the engine vibration to boot. The bike remained a strong seller throughout its production run. However, in 1959, with Lucas deciding to end production of its traditional magneto systems, BSA decided to delete the model from the range. And so ended the traditional BSA single. The Velaset MAC, or simply the Mac. Velaset's MAC or Mac model was introduced in 1933 and was a development of the earlier 250 MOV or MOV model. The first post-war Mac was introduced in 1948 and retained the girder forks of the early pre-war models. However, in 1951 these were replaced by the Doughty Automatic forks. These had originally been developed for use on the Velaset LE. 1953 would see a much upgraded model with fully adjustable rear suspension via swinging arm, as well as improvements to the gearbox and the clutch system. 1954 would also be the year that Velaset finally dropped the fishtail exhaust, so synonymous with Brooklands. The MAC used a single-cylinder 349cc air-cooled overhead valve engine with a bore and stroke of 68.5 by 96. Compression was very low, allowing the engine to run on the really terrible pooled petrol around at that time, at just 6.75 to 1. But probably the most distinctive feature of the engine was its Map of India timing cover. This housed a system of gears which ran to a very high camshaft. This meant the push rods were short, making the engine very tunable, as would later be proved in the Viper 350 and Venom 500cc sports models. The engine's very mild state of tune meant that it only produced around 15 horsepower, for a top speed of around 75 miles an hour. While the performance of the later models was dampened somewhat by the extra 31 kilos gained by that switch to a swinging arm frame, but of course it did make for a much better ride, and handling of the bike was extremely good. 1955 will see the introduction of the Viper sports model. This saw an increase in power to 28 horsepower and a very credible top speed of 91 miles an hour. And while the Viper would remain in production until 1968, the MAC was phased out of production in 1959. What collections of bikes would you like to see us do a video on? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.